So although Gamio and Hurston both lacked the leftist credentials of Du Bois and Martí, they were deeply concerned with the plight of poor migrants, and they similarly constructed interethnic and cross-class alliances. Gamio's Mexican immigrant informants are, quote, deeply offended at discovering a racial prejudice against them in the United States, in Gamio's terms, and respond with the self-denomination La Raza that cuts across differences of color, class, and acculturation, uniting Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, laborers, and professors. La Raza is a racialist term that paradoxically combats biological racism and determinism by extending racial identification beyond the conventional boundaries of skin color. It convenes a multiplicity of identities shaped by different nationalities, skin tones, and class locations in an act of defiance against U.S. racist discourses from the 1920s and early 1930s. Similarly, Hurston represents African Americans as a mingled people, racially mixed and heterogeneous in terms of class. So I'll end it there and open it up to questions.
I want to ask you more about Chapter 2, which sounded really fascinating. When you're talking about the Messianic, though, could you elaborate more on what that is? In other words, when I'm listening to I wasn't sure if it's sort of like driven by the Christocentric, or if it's something more Marxist, more overtly political, or is it syncretic? Is it drawing in from indigenous traditions, or is it a combination of those three things? So what is the Messianic in that context?
Well, I would say that the Messianic combines multiple cultural elements. One thing to know about the Messianic is that it's been viewed as escapism by many scholars, and that's not how it crops up in these three figures, Martí, Du Bois, and the Santa de Cabora. They're all figures who, in the case of Du Bois, there's an interest in how the Pan-African movements and Pan-Asian movements coincide with many Marxist movements, but then also multiple other social movements. The Dark Princess, I have to say, is a book about world movements. And so that's what accounts for its flights of fancy. That's what accounts for the marriage between the African American and the Dark Princess in the title from India. So all those movements combine and kind of funnel into this messianic figure of their son, who is kind of announces the coming of a different world, a new world that will be run by the Pan-African and Pan-Asian groups. Now, this is not to say that Du Bois wasn't attuned to the drawbacks in these movements. In particular, he was the novel registers disquiet with the elitism of many of these movements, especially the Pan-African and Pan-Asian movements. So he was critical of them, but he also held out for a kind of utopian future. Now, in the other, let's see, in Martí is resolutely utopian, but he's also resolutely practical about things. He was a practical organizer. He traveled up and down the East Coast organizing Cubans across class lines, across race lines. So his messianism was designed to stir up his speakers to accomplish a very concrete end, and that was to bring about the independence of Cuba. But he also imagined in Mother America, that speech, he also wanted to make sure that all of Latin America would struggle for a greater degree of independence from U.S. neocolonialism, but also for a greater degree of equality. And so that accounts for the messianic thrust in Martí. Now, for the Santa de Cabora, undoubtedly those indigenous groups were familiar with Christianity and worked within Christianity, but also undoubtedly they brought to bear their own cultural specificities to that. So some of that, there are descriptions of some of the indigenous leaders and their exhortations, but they're not they're accounts in the second person, and they're not transcriptions of what they said. So I'm not sure exactly what transpired there.
Could you just speak a little bit about what relations there were between the demonstrations, which you said took place mostly in the first decade of the 20th century, and the Mexican Revolution when it came? Was there a continuity of agitation and of demonstrations, or had that peaked and then was there a kind of ebb of such activity before the revolution, or is there some combination, or is it neither?
I'm not really sure how to. I think there was continuous resistance, but I think that just the Lauro Aguirre and the Santa de Cabora were kind of driven out of the game in a way. So they kept up the struggle with their newspaper, but eventually the newspaper folded and they parted ways. And I'm not really sure how to conceptualize that going forward. But it's a really interesting historical question. I hope someone takes it up. Thank you.